Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday. Giving Tuesday. It's light up the darkness. This class has been so great. Thank you to everybody who has already donated, supporting our nonprofit, Accidental Talmudist, during our annual campaign. If you haven't already, Giving Tuesday, wonderful time to do so. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. All our expenses have gone up this year, so please be generous. It really helps us to keep sharing Torah with more people around the world. Who's in the house tonight? Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon in New Jersey, Joseph in Englewood, Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandora in the Bronx, Guy in Ohio, Belle in Texas, who loves the music, Paula in the Great Northwest, Randy in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Ella in Southern California, Marjorie in Georgia, Alan in New York City, Spencer in Connecticut. Welcome, everybody. Let's be efficient. We've got a doubled off 2 pages, and they're both really short. Should come out to a short class, even with 2 pages. We are working our way through the final chapter here in Tractate Bava Basra, 23rd volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1. Our dafs are pages 161 and 162. Picking this up near the top of page 161a. And what we're talking about in this Mishnah is technically how did the sages, what were the requirements both sort of before the period when the Mishnah was closed, around the year 200, and then later. So even when the sages of the Gemara, known as Amoraim, are discussing these kinds of documents, what the laws are of these kinds of documents, for them, it was already ancient history. These kinds of documents were not being used. Why then were they studying the laws of these kinds of documents and how essentially earlier sages had made sure that documents weren't counterfeited? Yeah, in part because maybe there were some old documents lying around and they would need to make a ruling, but more because in the same way that we study with great detail and specificity what were the laws of the sacrifices and the manner in which they were brought in the temple, even though we haven't had the Holy Temple or brought sacrifices in almost 2,000 years, studying those laws nevertheless is a mitzvah in itself. And we grow in wisdom from understanding these laws and what the sages were trying to do. And there are inherent principles here that for sure are relevant in every generation. So as we sort of sit in on this discussion among the sages about what were basically the ancient security features of these kinds of deeds of transfer. And in our Mishnah, we're discussing 2 kinds: the open deed, or the ordinary deed, in which, much like modern documents, you have the text of what is being transferred, and then the witnesses sign on the same side of the page. And then this tied document, which we no longer use, and they weren't even using at the time of these discussions, where the document was folded essentially sort of like accordion folds, and then the folds were tied. And as we learned yesterday, this was initially created in order to discourage quick-tempered priests from divorcing their wives. Since a priest cannot marry a divorced woman, if they gave the woman a bill of divorce, if they gave their wives a bill of divorce, then they're divorced and they can't remarry. A regular Jew could remarry his wife after he divorces her if she hasn't been married to someone else in the meantime. But once they started making bills of divorce in this manner, the practice extended to other kinds of deeds. And then, like I said, by the end of the Second Temple period, they were hardly being used. We do have an example of such a document as late as around the year 135 of the Common Era. The temple fell around the year 70. By the year 200, when the Mishna closes, they were hardly ever being used, if ever. And beyond that, in the times of the Gemara, which is like sort of between the years 200 and 500 of the Common Era, they definitely weren't using such documents as the tied deeds or the tied documents. Nonetheless, let's see if we can discern what are the underlying principles that the sages who lived in the time of those documents were using, and the sages who were arguing about it later. What was it that they were looking for to make sure that counterfeiters, fraudsters, and regular people who don't commit fraud, what were the issues that were being debated here? Okay. So Rami Bar Chama asked Rav Chisda, and according to Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba, who says that the witnesses sign on the back of the written side, this is in the tied document, not the ordinary document, taking care that the signatures are exactly opposite the writing on the outside, well, let there be a concern that perhaps the party holding the document will write whatever he wants on the inside, i.e. the front of the document, adding to the text, and then have extra witnesses come and sign on the outside. And he will say to anyone questioning the number of witnesses being more than the minimum, which we learned for a tied document was 3, and he will say, I did this in order to increase the number of witnesses, the more to publicize the matters written in the document. In other words, he could have a fraudulent scheme in which he's adding text to this contract that will perhaps convey him more property or less property if he's the seller. Excuse me. And then the security feature that we were talking about yesterday, where the witnesses sign in such a way that no text can be added. Okay, well here, no text could be added after those witnesses sign, but then you could add other text and other witnesses. And then maybe people won't look so closely and they won't realize that this deed has been altered. How do we protect against that? And Rav Chisda said to him, do you maintain that the witnesses sign in order? That is, one under the other, starting from the top of the page on the back of the document, since that's where people sign on a bound document, a tied document. That is not correct. Rather, the witnesses sign from the bottom to the top. The witnesses sign in a perpendicular direction relative to the text of the document, and the first signature begins on the reverse side of the last line of the document, and it continues upward toward the first line. There is therefore no possibility of adding to the text of the document, as if the text extended beyond the beginning of the signatures, it would be recognized as a forgery. Rami Bar Chama continues to question the method of signature prescribed by Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba. But let there be a concern that perhaps something detrimental to the holder of the document happens to appear in the final line of the document, and he erases the final line. And in doing so, he excises the first name of the witness on the opposite side as well. So, for instance, if the witness's name is Reuven, the son of Yaakov, Reuven ben Yaakov, so he will excise the name Reuven along with the final line of the document, and the document will be rendered valid with the remaining part of the signature, ben Yaakov, witness. As we learned in the Mishna tractate Gittin, if one signs ben so-and-so, right? If somebody, like my Hebrew name is Yoel ben Avinoam, I could sign a document ben Avinoam, just son of Avinoam, and that would work. We said earlier, especially in a society where they knew who the witnesses were, that would work. We don't make it invalid if he didn't say the whole thing, Yoel ben Avinoam. If he said ben Avinoam, it's enough. So therefore, you could cut out some. In other words, if you cut off the bottom of the document, what you would lose is that extra text that you don't want in it. And since on the back they're writing like this, you see on the front you see the text. On the back is the witnesses' signatures, and since they're written perpendicular to the direction of the text on the front side, what you would lose is the first name of some witnesses, but it wouldn't matter since we've said that son of so-and-so suffices as a signature. So that would be a way for them to cut off some of the text if they didn't want it in the document. So how do we protect against that? So the Gemara answers, it is a case where it is written, Reuven, son of, on one line, opposite the final line of the document, and his father's name, Yaakov, and the word witness above it, beginning from the penultimate line of the document and continuing upward in a perpendicular manner. And that is to say, a tied document is valid only if the witnesses sign in this manner. In this case, if the final line of the document were to be excised, cut off, not erased, but cut off, all that will remain of the signature will be Yaakov, witness, and that is not a valid signature. Rami Bar Chama continues to ask, Rabbi Bar Chama is very concerned about any possibility that a fraudster will commit fraud. But let there be a concern that perhaps he will excise, he will cut off the final line of the document, along with the words Reuven, son of, and the document will be rendered valid with the remaining part of the signature. Yaakov, witness. You said that's not valid. It is valid. As we learned in the Mishna, Tractate Gittin, if someone signs simply saying so-and-so, meaning just his first name, and witness, well, the document is valid. And the Gemara answers, it is a case where the word witness is not written after the witness's names. That is, a tied document is valid only if the word witness does not appear after the signatures. It is only in such a case that the document cannot be materially changed by excising the final line without rendering the witnesses' names disqualified, because a first name without the son of the father or the word witness is not a valid signature. And so this contract would be rendered invalid. And if you wish, say instead that actually the witness did write the word witness after his signature, and the case is one where we know for a fact that this signature, which consists of the word Yaakov, is not Yaakov's signature. That is, it is known for a fact that there is no one living in the city where the document was written who is named Yaakov and whose signature matches the signature on this document. Therefore, the court will recognize that the signature must have originally stated so-and-so son of Yaakov, witness, and that the last line had been excised, and they will invalidate it. From which we're seeing, it's funny, we attended a very interesting ceremony today, Nina and I. We live in LA, which had a horrible, no matter what party you're from, no matter what your politics are, we had a horrible district attorney running the city who just let crime run rampant, and everyone was so disgusted with it that he was voted out of office in the last election by 20 points. And the new district attorney is a guy named Nathan Hochman, who we've met personally. So it was kind of nice to see a swearing-in ceremony down near City Hall. And one thing that he said in his remarks after being sworn in is that there's no such thing as one-size-fits-all justice. You know, when you make blanket pronouncements, obviously you have to pass laws. But when you try to pass blanket pronouncements, we're not going to investigate this kind of case, or we're going to free everyone who's this kind of criminal, or things like that, it's just lazy legislation, because different cases require investigation. And here we're seeing that, well, we're going to put in as many safeguards as we can in these documents, but we're not going to say that, well, if the safeguard is there, the document is automatically valid. The court will have to do its own investigation. And that's something we've been seeing for several weeks when they talk about that a witness will be called in to ratify a document. Right? What does it mean to ratify a document? What it means is that the court will investigate whether the document is legitimate or not, bringing in the people who signed it or the people who recognize their signatures, etc. That you can't make these blanket pronouncements because every case is a little different and requires some investigation. Okay, Rami Bar Chama is not done with his challenges, and we're on page 161b. But perhaps the witness signed using the name of his father instead of his own name as a gesture of respect toward his father. That would be weird, right? His name is, let's say, Yoel, and instead of signing Yoel, he signs Avinom, because everyone knows that his father is Avinom and that he would sign as a measure of respect for his father's name, when he is being, swearing that this is what happened and he's signing as a witness. Very odd, right? Very unlikely circumstance, even in ancient times. And the Gemara answers, this is not done. A person does not discard his own name and sign using only the name of his father. Now, what's interesting here is that Rami Bar Chama is raising as an objection a potential, type of fraud that is so unlikely that the Gemara's answer is, yeah, that doesn't happen. And yet, his objection and the answer are recorded in the Gemara, so they're being very careful. Rami Bar Chama challenges further. But perhaps the witness made this name, his father's name, into a mere distinguishing mark that he uses as his signature, right? He's using his father's name not as his father's name, but perhaps a particular way of signing his father's name with a flourish or something, and he's using that as his mark. And that's what makes it a mark of respect toward his father. And where do people use a mark? It's not only illiterate people who might use a mark as a signature, because in fact, it is known that Rav used to draw a fish as his signature mark, rather than signing his name. And Rabbi Hanina used to draw a palm branch as his signature mark. And Rav Chisda used to sign just the letter Samech. And Rav Hoshaya used to sign just the letter Ayin. And Rava bar Rav Huna used to sign his name by drawing a ship's mast. So if they were using these kinds of markings in place of their signature, well, then maybe someone might use his father's name, perhaps drawn out in a particular way, as a mark of a signature, not as the signature itself. And the Gemara answers, yeah, but a person is not so insolent as to use his father's name as a distinguishing mark. So nice try, Rami Bar Chama, but no. Mar Zutra said, why do you need all this? Why go to such lengths to answer the question posed above? There's a simpler answer. Any tied document whose witnesses do not end on a single line is not valid. The Gemara had previously assumed that the witnesses sign one after the other, beginning at the document's bottom line and going upward toward the first line. And this arrangement leaves open the possibility that the signature of the first witness could be truncated by an unscrupulous party. Mar Zutra explains that this is not so. Rather, the signatures are written with each one beginning opposite the bottom line and heading upward toward the beginning of the document. Therefore, if a line of text is excised from the bottom of the document, the names of all the witnesses on the reverse side will be truncated, and the forgery will become apparent. And that's where they leave off that question. Next question. Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Yochanan says there are two halachas, two laws, with regard to documents. For any erasures, right? So if the scribe wrote the document and then he realized he made a mistake and he erased it, right? And it's going to be a little bit obvious that he erased something. He's leaving a gap. For any erasures in a document, the scribe must write at the end of the document, and this is their verification. That is, he must list the erasures, stating that on line so-and-so there is an erasure, and a correction stating such and such for each erasure. And the second halacha is that the scribe must review some of the details of the document in the final line of the document. Very interesting. Let's say there was a whole bunch of terms about this field that was being sold and what the measurements of the field are and what the landmarks describing that people can look to in order to ascertain the measurements around the field and how much money is going to be paid and when it's going to be paid and who's buying and who's selling, all these kinds of details. So in the last line, the scribe has to write some of these details. And this is the field that was sold on such and such a day near such and such a river. Now, he was very specific in all the other things that was necessary, and only some of those details, basically randomly chosen, have to be included in the last line of the document. It's kind of odd, right? Wouldn't you say either, okay, then you have to repeat all the key details, or you're going to repeat one type of key detail, but it just says some details. So why would that be? What is the reason for this second requirement? Now we're on page 162a. And Rav Amram says, it is because one may not learn any new details from the final line of the document. There is a concern that the holder of the document may have written in an extra line of text to his advantage between the text and the witness's signatures. Therefore, any new information contained in the last line is disregarded. Since the final line is disregarded, it is necessary that the final line of a document contain only a review of what is already written in it, meaning that that last line is really acting as a placeholder. So the scribe could write, and this was sworn to me on this day, and I heard it on this day. In other words, he's just going to repeat some kind of details because really the last line is not any new information. We're not going to derive any information in litigation from that last line. It's just being used to say this is the last line and no text came after it. Rav Nachman said to Rav Amram, from where do you know this? That the last line is disregarded and it's just kind of filler. And Rav Amram said to him, as it is taught in a Baraisa, Tosefta of 11.1, if one writing a document distanced the witness's signatures 2 lines from the text of the document, leaving 2 lines blank, the document is not valid, as it would be possible for the holder of the document to fill in false information in those lines. But if one distanced the signatures 1 line from the text, then the document is valid. Now, Rav Amram analyzes that Baraisa to get back to his conclusion about putting filler in the last line. What is different in the case of 2 blank lines, that the document is not valid? If you say that perhaps the holder of the document will take advantage of those 2 blank lines and forge unverified information and write it in those lines, well then, in the case of one who left 1 line blank as well, he could forge information and write it in that line. Rather, must one not conclude from the Baraisa that one may not learn any new details from the final line of a document. Therefore, only when 2 lines are left blank is there a concern that false information would be added to the penultimate line. And the Gemara affirms, conclude from this Baraisa, that that is so. Now we're on page 162b. And I'm pretty close to done, so if you have questions or comments, please get them in now. A dilemma was raised before the sages. If the space of 1.5 lines is left blank, what is the law? And the Gemara seeks a solution to the dilemma. Come in here, what was stated in the Baraisa cited earlier. If one writing a document distanced the witness's signatures 2 lines from the text of the document, leaving 2 lines blank, the document is not valid, so one can infer. But if there's a gap of only 1 line, of only 1.5 lines, the document is valid. And of course, we can predict what's going to come next. If you say that because if you leave 2 lines blank, it's not valid, therefore 1.5 lines is valid. But didn't we also learn that if you leave 1 line blank, it is valid, from which we can infer that if you leave 1.5 lines blank, it is not valid? Let's see. The Gemara deflects this proof. Say that the last clause of the Baraisa, if one writing a document distanced the witness's signatures 1 line from the text of the document is valid, and from this one can infer it is only when there is a gap of 1 line that the document is valid. But if there's a gap of 1.5 lines, it is not valid. And the Gemara states, rather, no inference is to be learned from that Baraisa. So what halakhic conclusion was reached about this question of leaving a line and a half? Come and hear a proof from a different source. As it is taught in a baraisa, if one writing a document distanced the witness's signatures 2 lines from the text of the document is not valid. But if the gap is less than that, it is valid. Now, it is clear from the baraisa that any gap less than 2 full lines does not invalidate the document. The baraisa continues, if there were 4 or 5 witnesses signed on the document and one of them was found to be a relative of one of the parties in the document, or one of them was found to be otherwise disqualified from bearing witness, the testimony on the document may be established via the other witnesses, right? If you have more witnesses than you need, and 1 or 2 of them is disqualified, but you still have the requisite number of witnesses to make a document valid, and those witnesses have not been disqualified, we don't render the document invalid because we have sufficient qualified witnesses. Now the Gemara draws a further conclusion from this baraisa, and this supports the opinion of Chizkiah. As Chizkiah says, if one filled in the gap between the document and the signatures with signatures of relatives, the document is valid. In other words, the signatures of relatives are meaningless. They can't be used as witnesses, so it's just filler, but it's not going to invalidate the document because we still have text properly written of the actual deed of the document and the right number of qualified witnesses. So these additional names who are unqualified to be witnesses because they're relatives are not going to render the document invalid. And Chizkiah continued, and do not be surprised by this, as a similar situation is found with regard to the roofing of a sukkah, known as the schach. Empty space in the roofing of a sukkah disqualifies the sukkah if the space extends for 3 handbreadths. If you have this big a gap in the schach, in the roof of your sukkah, you're going to render the sukkah invalid. But if it's less than that, less than 3 handbreadths, then that's okay. You're supposed to have gaps in the roof. You have to be able to see the stars through the roof of your sukkah, even though it has to provide more shade than not. Whereas materials that are unfit to be used as roofing disqualify the sukkah only if the unfit material extends for 4 handbreadths, right? There are materials that you can use, like cut branches from trees, and there are materials that you can not use as the roofing of a sukkah. Certainly any limbs that are still attached to a vine or to a tree, they do not work. They have to be cut off, or other kinds of materials that are no good for the roof of a sukkah. Well, if those no good materials extend 4 handbreadths, then they invalidate the sukkah. But if it was 3 handbreadths of invalid material, it would not disqualify the sukkah, even though a gap of more than 3 handbreadths would. So what are we learning from this? If a sukkah had a gap in its roofing of 3 handbreadths, it is disqualified. But if the gap is filled with unfit material, the sukkah is valid, since it is less than 4 handbreadths. And this is comparable to the situation with a document. If there is a significant gap between the text and the signatures, the document is not valid. But if the gap is filled with the signatures of even people who are disqualified from bearing witness, the document is valid. And we shouldn't be surprised because it's filled. What we don't want is a big blank space. So we're filling it with something. So even if it's the signatures of disqualified witnesses, it really doesn't matter. It could just be squiggles. But it's filled, and therefore the document is valid. And that concludes our page for today. We'll pick it up tomorrow, God willing, at the regular Wednesday time, 6 p.m. Pacific, with page 163. I have 3 questions, so I'll take those, and I'll just remind us, Giving Tuesday. Please support Accidental Talmudist. We really need your help. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Yosef, can you sign a document with your English name, such as, and now he wrote in Hebrew, Yosef Urso, and it's legal, or does it have to be your Hebrew name, Yosef Yeshiyahu ben Avraham? Very interesting, right? So Yosef is saying, he's writing in Hebrew, using Hebrew letters, But you can use Hebrew letters to give your Hebrew name, right? My Hebrew name is Yoel ben Avinoam. But I could also use Hebrew letters to spell out Salad or Litvak, right? So in a contract according to Jewish law, do you need to use your Hebrew name, or is it going to be sufficient to use your secular name but written in Hebrew letters? Amazing question. I have no idea what the answer to that is. That's why if you're ever, let's say getting a document for a ketubah, because you're getting married, please God. Somebody's getting married. Now, usually in a ketubah, they will do the Hebrew names. And very often these days, the ketubah will also include, English text with the English names. But in that situation, you wouldn't rely on what you learned in my Daf Yomi Shir on, December 3rd, 2024, because you'd have an officiating rabbi, and he would make sure that the ketubah was kosher. So I don't know the answer. Ask an expert. Either a scribe or a poskening rabbi on those kinds of questions. But great question. Okay, Sharon, by what methods were erasures done? I would think it would damage the surface of the parchment. So I think that maybe, they've implied two kinds of erasures. One where you'd see that something was erased, but you don't know what was there. It would damage it a little bit. I don't think it would go through, but you would see that something had been, scratched away, or maybe some kind of solvent and taken away the ink. And that's why the scribe had to say something was erased in that spot, and I did it. And so we all know, and the witnesses know, that there was an erasure. Or, maybe even more important would be the kind of erasure where there is no damage, and it's a perfect removal of the ink, but you leave a blank, right? And that has to be verified also. Now, what would be really interesting is if they had a way of removing the ink in a way that does no damage, and then they wrote over that spot. So it would not be visible to the naked eye that there had been an erasure. And maybe for that reason, it becomes even more important that they, make a verification at the bottom of the document that I, the scribe, erased on this line. Probably he would say, and I replaced it with. I erased these words and replaced them with these words. And it will be very important to make sure that there is no fraud. And finally, Jonathan, the last line is the Talmud version of this page left intentionally blank, right? Which anyone who's ever read a contract, the signed version of the contract, right? Not the many red line drafts that go back and forth as the parties are working out the negotiation. But when they get to the end, right, very often you have this page left intentionally blank, But this is also another reason, of course, why people will photograph, will have, what's the word I'm looking for, where you go to a notary public to make sure that that document has not been changed in the meantime, because what's really different now versus in the old days, right, is that everything has counterparts. That's not something they did, right? They would make one deed, right? And the one who ends up with the property keeps the deed. And maybe if really wealthy people were making a big deal, they would write out by hand, 2 complete copies, and they both kept it, maybe. But now everything is done with counterparts. So there's much less opportunity for fraud since, there's multiple copies. And if you try to make a forgery on one part of it, it's obviously going to contradict the other counterparts. But we're certainly familiar with this. This page left intentionally blank. And I agree. This is the Talmudic equivalent of that. That's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, see you tomorrow, Wednesday, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night. And reminder, somebody else asked me that now, just in the winter, Fridays, instead of our usual noon Pacific, we're going a half hour early, 11:30 a.m. and keeping it to a half hour. So people on the East Coast, who are scrambling to get ready for Shabbos would have less trouble doing that than if we started at noon and went long. Have a good night.